afternoon, and for everyone wherever you may be on the face of the globe, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and good everything. It is good everything because I'm excited at this distinguished discussion today. But what gives me even more excitement is the incredible work that the Annual Conference Committee has done under the leadership of Dr. Teresa Avila. I'm not going to take up much of your time. Without further ado, Teresa, take it away.
Thank you, Meme. I am Dr. Teresa Avila. I am a curator and an art historian working at CSU Channel Islands as an associate professor of non-Western art. I am also the chair of the Annual Conference Committee since 2021. This is my final year in this position, and I want to take a moment to acknowledge the significant role the ACC plays in materializing the annual conference. In anticipation of the call for submissions coming out soon after this conference is over, we have already hosted a session supporting forthcoming submissions to the 2025 conference in New York, and it's titled the Submission Workshop. I encourage you to look for it. It'll be available through April in the recordings. And on that note, I want to encourage all in listening range to take action through getting involved with this organization, through submissions, through committees, through affiliated societies. We have a council of readers who read all conference submissions and are vital in the first review of submissions to the conference. And there are over 50 diverse affiliated committees and societies that you can join and get involved in. Please look at the CAA website for more information. This is a member-driven, member-run organization. If you're not happy with what you see, if you want more of something, please bring it forward. Please get involved. Now, about the Distinguished Scholar Session. This was established in 2001. The Distinguished Scholar Session traditionally illuminates and celebrates the contributions of senior art historians. The Annual Conference Committee identifies the distinguished scholar each year and gives the session a popular time slot in the conference program, typically a Thursday afternoon, and here we are. Each session typically brings together the distinguished scholar, a session chair, today we have two, and a group of panelists. The scholar's remarks usually follow the presentations. The honoree's involvement is fundamental to the series as a way of demonstrating a living tradition that gives voice to the continuities and ruptures that have shaped art historical scholarship from the 20th century into the new millennium. Not intended as a static honor, the event brings the honoree together with his or her colleagues, oftentimes the scholar's former students. In this way, the session can therefore be viewed as the equivalent of a living Festschrift, an occasion for applauding, examining, and extending a distinguished career in art history, and an opportunity for encouraging dialogue between and among several generations of scholars. I encourage that. This year's distinguished scholar is S. Hollis Clayson. Clayson has been at the forefront of art history scholarship as part of the first generation of feminist academics, working on representation of the female body, the role of art in social and political conflict, and the intersection of art and technology. Hollis Clayson is Professor Emerita of Art History and Bergen Evans Professor Emerita in the Humanities at Northwestern University after she taught there for 35 years, advising 27 doctoral dissertations. A specialist in 19th century European art, she has published widely on art practice in Paris as well as transatlantic cultural exchanges, especially those between France and the United States. The Annual Conference Committee received a high volumes of nominations which signaled Clayson being this year's Distinguished Scholar. So for those in this space who are burning to celebrate and draw attention to the significant contributions of their senior or advanced career colleagues and or mentors, know that CAA is accepting nominations for Distinguished Scholars on a rolling basis. So please check the website for more information and opportunities to do so. Today, Dr. Clayson's career and her impact on the field will be celebrated with the presentations and a dialogue with scholars and colleagues, including as session chairs, and Helmreich from Smithsonian Archives of American Art, and Hector Reyes from the University of Southern California. I will now turn over the stage to the chairs to introduce themselves and the session panelists as we begin this session. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Ann Helmreich. And maybe Hector, I'll let you stand up and share the microphone for a moment. My tie with Holly is I am a former PhD student, as the Germans would say, Dr. Father or Dr. Mutter, I think. So I'm pleased to be here, and Hector shares a similar
Yes, my name's Hector Reyes, and she also advised me.
So this will get more inspiring as we move along. This is an opportunity to honor and recognize Holly and to bring together 4 distinguished scholars whose careers have intersected with that of Holly, whose conversation, scholarship, and insights have, in Holly's words, shaped her work. And I think this is a real moment of scholarly generosity to recognize the ways in which our work builds upon and intersects with and cannot be possible without our colleagues. Before we turn it over to these scholars, Hector and I would like to say a few words about Holly and her work. As you heard, as a scholar, she has definitively shaped the fields of feminist art history and the social history of art. She's rewritten the history of 19th century French art and visual culture, redefined the terms by which we consider transatlantic histories of artistic production and reception, and above all, made us question and look anew again and again. She has made us realize and recognize, as she so cogently states, that the project of modernism was a gendered one, that art is complicit in the regulation of sexualities, and that political, social, and artistic change are symbiotically and epistemologically related, intertwined, imbricated. Her desire to engage with the archive and the practice of close reading of evidence, the work of art and the text, both with and against the grain, as well as her willingness to grasp and work with paradox, has resulted in profound new readings. Her acknowledgement that the past is always read through the lens of the present has made her history of art immediately relevant and worthy of passionate debate. And while this afternoon's panel focuses on her scholarship, that body of work cannot be separated from her work as a teacher and as an interlocutor in so many contexts and settings, helping others to advance their arguments. And I see some former students out there as well. She's had an impact beyond art history to humanistic inquiry more generally. She was the founding director of the Alice Kaplan Institute for the Humanities at Northwestern University. And I also want to acknowledge that she's received scholarly recognition by her distinguished appointments and awards, including the Samuel H. Kress Professorship and Paul Mellon Visiting Senior Fellow at the Center for Advanced Study in the Visual Arts. And I know Stephen is out there someplace behind the lights. She's had professorships at the Clark Art Institute, the Institut National d'Histoire de l'Art in France, and the Institute of Fine Arts at NYU. And she's also received the Chevalier d'Ordre de la Palme Académique. She's currently at work on a new publication project, The Ground Will Never Be Still Underneath Her Feet, on the Eiffel Tower, which has been supported by fellowships at the Center for Visual Arts as the Paul Mellon Visiting Senior Fellow and the Huntington Library and Gardens. It promises to be another tour de force, bringing together close readings of objects and practices as she investigates its role as a metonym for the French capital and empire. It's another opportunity for Holly to display her uncanny ability to zoom in and out, to work from the granular to the broad expanse, from Paris to the far reaches of the empire, and recognizing how form and meaning are reconfigured and redeployed in shifting contextual conditions. I'm going to turn it over to my colleague Hector to say a few words, and then we'll be introducing the panelists as they come up to give their presentations.
It's a great honor to be celebrating Holly's distinguished career today and to do so within this institutional context. The College Art Association, who we thank again for this celebration. Institutions need a shape, they need a form, they need structure, but they also need to be sustainable. They need a plan for change, space for openness, possibilities for dynamic inclusion of people and events that we don't yet see. To think about institutions is a lot like thinking like an artist. It is to see both form and possibilities. Holly's work, broadly conceived, epitomizes this dynamic energy. One sees it in her research, her teaching, her service, her incredible service to universities, to CAA, to her students, But if I can use a Hollyism here, it is her eagle-eyed perspective that allows her to see the structures of art history, of the humanities, in their most essential and substantive forms. And it seems to me that the mechanism that sustains and moves forward these structures that she perspicaciously perceives is conversation, interlocution, and exchange. Anyone who's had the benefit of sitting in front of a painting with Holly knows what a dynamic, exciting, moving, and surprising encounter it is. Anyone who's read her work knows what a challenge to their idée reçue they faced. Taking seriously the fundamental encounter with painting seems metonymically linked to the way she encounters other minds, other consciousness, other institutional structures, other discourses. When I was a graduate student, I had the benefit of seeing Holly as director of the Alice Kaplan Humanities Institute at Northwestern, and I saw how deeply she thought about the humanities. It made me very aware of how she never took for granted art history as a discipline. Art history was one of the many important and dynamic ways of engaging with the past, one set of tools. Holly's perspicacity and her willingness to engage dynamically in interlocution is evinced powerfully in her book, Paris in Despair. In that book, she examines a prehistory to the foundational moment of modernism, the first Impressionist gallery exhibition. And she thinks really hard about what it was to be an artist, what it was to be an artist in the French tradition, what it was to be an artist in Paris, what it was to not be an artist in Paris. All of these questions seem to me a profound reconfiguring of history, a profound reflection on what it means to write and imagine history and the role that art can play in writing that history. Conversation rewrites the forgotten possibilities of the past and moves us forward from the structures that can so quickly become ossified and repetitive. The spirit of conversation is very much on display here in this panel with these distinguished guests who in their own career have been important interlocutors for Holly. And it's with great pleasure that I turn the floor over now to let them speak about Holly. The order of the speakers is different from what appears in the program. We have invited them to come forward in what might be described as a chronological order. With Tom Crow initiating the talks as someone who had known Holly since their formative days in graduate study, and André Dombrowski as the fourth speaker, as someone with whom Holly has recently collaborated. We'll briefly introduce each as they come to the podium. They have each been asked to speak for 15 to 20 minutes, and then we will invite Holly to share thoughts with us and then open the proceedings to discussion. Thomas Crow is the Rosalie Solo Professor of Modern Art at the Institute of Fine Arts, New York University. Before his appointment at the Institute of Fine Arts, Crow was director of the Getty Research Institute, professor of art history at the University of Southern California, professor and chair of the history of the art at the University of Sussex, and Robert Lehman Professor of the history of art at Yale. He has written groundbreaking monographs on 18th century art, as well as 20th century art. Just to name a few, he is currently working on the hidden mod in modern art, London, 1956 to 1969. Holly, in the acknowledgements to Painted Love, Prostitution in French Art of the Impressionist Era, credits Tom's comments for reigniting work on a stalled project. We invite him to the podium to ignite today's proceedings.
Well, many, many thanks, Anne and Hector, for making this whole occasion happen, and of course to Holly. The Painted Love thing was actually based on miscommunication. I had suggested the title Tainted Love after the soft sell cover of the song of that name. But she heard it differently and, of course, derived a much more appropriate title for her work out of that. But that was kind of the sort of conversations we would tend to have. And I want to start by acknowledging a very deep debt I've always felt to Holly. The first book I wrote had the word Paris in the title, as several of Holly's have had. And it was to Paris that she introduced me as a researcher rather than a tourist or a slightly lost undergraduate exchange student. It had only been 8 years before that I'd first experienced the city as an undergrad on semester abroad, an arrival that had carried its own drama. As my Pomona friends and I happened to arrive for our extended sojourn on the 1st of May, 1968. So my coming back to Paris 8 years later with ideas for an art history dissertation in my head obviously met with nothing like the prolonged turmoil and rebellion that had dominated my last experience there. In fact, it was a kind of soporific midsummer, as I remember, one of the hottest in recent memory, when I met Holly at our prearranged rendezvous on my first day, the Café de la Paix in the Place de l'Opéra. I remember all the facades washed out in the intense late morning sun, with the shade under the cafe awning a bare respite from the heat, and Holly, of course, was already there. And I had the best connection to the city I could have wanted. And I think the first story that Holly had to tell about her experiences reveals volumes about her. Of course, the first destination for all of us was the Bibliothèque Nationale, then in the heart of the city on the Rue Richelieu, where the specialized art history library is now. But then there was that library right there in that historic building that was offering the wealth of everything. And figuring out how to navigate it and exploit that unimaginable abundance was the first challenge, at least for this naive Californian. On Holly's arrival, if I'm remembering right, she was going to obviously be much more adept at her navigation of the Bayen than I was ready to be, but she had to postpone that experience because the Bayen was on its annual closure, if that's right. So what would she do? Well, as we all know, her dissertation topic was on the subject of prostitution and the figure of the prostitute in French modern life painting, which was a much mooted topic in those days, but one that nobody had ever really examined systematically or with much in the way of historical depth. What was more, she had had to endure the high-handed disdain of the old bulls of French art history for les études iconographiques. But the outcome, of course, would be the landmark aforementioned, Painted Love, prostitution in the French art of the Impressionist era. Now, her subject matter was not exactly a crime in France, but it did involve the significant involvement of the police. So where would she have gone while the Bayen remained closed? Naturally, to the archives of the Préfecture de Police. It was a deep-end immersion in the raw end of social history, to be sure. And my sense of it was that her subsequent interpretations possessed a certain solidity like no one else's on account of that ground-level apprehension of Paris in its past and in the visible manifestations of that past that surrounded us. So over our Grand Crème, looking out at the sun-bleached facades of Baron Haussmann's urban transformations, in which we'd so steeped ourselves reading books about it in Los Angeles, there began dialogues about art, culture, history, in which the city of Paris played the part of a constant interlocutor. It was one that sustained me in my own research that followed during the coming autumn and winter of that year. But I say with admiration that Holly has demonstrated the immense rewards that follow from keeping faith with the city over a lifetime. Paris, the capital of the 19th century, as Walter Benjamin memorably called it, though we're now in a time when Benjamin's authority and prestige only grows, but his memorable epithet for the city that nourished him might strike a discordant note. That is, in a discipline that has come to pride itself on decentering, talk of capitals can seem a little bit discordant. I said that already. A little bit, how to say, awkward. But Holly has been up to the challenge, mounting with André an immensely productive conference and book under the rubric, "Is Paris Still the Capital of the 19th Century?" However one wants to answer that question, and they left the question open, no reasonable answer should entail treating the annals of visual arts engendered there as somehow exhausted. There's just so much more to learn. And when Holly and I met that day in the Place de l'Opéra, it was really just getting started, which makes it still, to this day now, a relatively new project in intellectual history, an open-ended vision in no way concluded, and in no way one that impinges on the alternatives proposed by others. I think the idea that the study of Impressionist and post-Impressionist Paris represents some kind of hegemonic juggernaut reflects more the touristic mirage of the city, public relations holdover, than it does the genuine and, as I'm saying, only half-finished history of the epic in that place. And Holly has gone straight at that mirage in her recent work, tackling, for example, what it really meant for Paris to become the city of light. Its technology, its financing, its complicated chronology, its unintended effects on everyday life, as well as the threats to that other complementary form of romance, which would be the play of disguise in the urban nocturne. As her customary approach, as is her customary approach, the weave of historical insight and meticulously reported research leads as readily and unpredictably to an ephemeral newspaper illustration as it does to a celebrated work of art, but it always includes both. They indeed follow one another like a string of lights, each offering its own kind of illumination in a concert of visual moments. Hers is among our best current templates, students take note, for how you actually put an art historical account down on the page, and do so in a way that's free from hierarchies of status and class. The tricky business of finding the right words for these compellingly sudden revelations of the past is where she excels, just as she does in identifying and gathering them all in the first place, which testifies to her acumen and diligence as a scholar. Now, anybody who somehow resents the perceived centrality of Paris might take a perverse sort of pleasure in one of Holly's most impressive achievements, the magisterial and beautifully produced Paris in Despair, which Hector has appropriately already highlighted for us. Her remarkable subject, unlooked for in any existing historiography, is the city as an organism with all its varied arts during the 4 months of duress, cold, and privation, under siege by the Prussian guns in the latter part of 1870 until the next year. This was the proud city, the capital of pleasure just a moment before, now on its knees. It had been convenient in the past to assume that the hiatus of the siege, with major artists like Pissarro and Cézanne and Monet absent for the duration, saw next to no significant artistic production. A supposition that turned out to be its own kind of abdication of the city's defense. Holly's hypothesis, born of her commitment to the city as an object of learning, was one of resilience and new circuits of expressive possibility, not to say expressive necessity, born of this once-in-a-century disruption. As such, that catastrophic period presents itself as a kind of early stress test on the emergent support system for independent art making, with even the first Impressionist group exhibition still years away and the academic system also in abeyance. Artists of all persuasions found themselves in uniform, following unfamiliar routes across the city and mixing with unexpected company as they made their way to and from their daily sentry positions on the defensive ramparts. One could take this episode as isolating a set of minimum conditions for making art, an accelerated experiment to assess what remained, what was lost, what was decisively changed in advance of the storied decade of avant-gardism that immediately followed. As Holly deeply explores the senseless loss of Henri Regnault, for one, on a useless sortie near the end of the conflict, proved an immeasurable loss and a permanent distortion of the artistic force field. But still, why would the continuity of Paris as an art historical focus matter if interests and attention have truly migrated elsewhere? The historiographical fact of the matter is that the ways of doing art history that have now become routine across almost all fields were hammered out over approaches to Parisian modern life painting. A lot of that hammering out, I should say, happened in the face of obdurate opposition from the old guard of the discipline, not just in France, but here a fortiori. But it was exactly the candy box idea of sunny, unproblematic impressionism that allowed a grown-up, seriously researched optic on that art to stand out in dramatic relief, more than probably would have been the case with any other subfield. As it turned out, the attraction that discerning people felt for this art, Impressionism, Post-Impressionism, was in fact an intuition of the complex richness that those paintings contain. But it took a new generation of scholars and a great deal of hard work to lend those intuitions the specific historical underpinnings needed for historical understanding. keep up with what I've been calling here the half-finished art history of Paris is not only still of great intrinsic interest in itself, but it connects the modern discipline to one of the main places it came from, whatever it may now be setting its sights on. To that end, no one has made or continues to make a greater contribution than my friend Hollis Clayson. Thank you.
Our next speaker will be Martha Ward, Associate Professor of Art History, University of Chicago, who also appears in the acknowledgments of Painted Love for Holly's gratitude for friendship, support, and high standards. The ideal combination. In Paris in Despair, Holly remarks that a medal should be struck to reward Marty for reading and commenting beneficially on an earlier version of the manuscript. Holly and Marty have taught together, with Marty's attention to issues of display and reception dovetailing beautifully with Holly's engagement with production and materiality. Martha has authored numerous studies offering innovative insights into Impressionism, Neo-Impressionism, and the creation of modern exhibition culture. Her current study, The Art Show, looks to museums and other sites in the first half of the 20th century in relation to aesthetic, social, and political developments. Please welcome Marty.
Honored to contribute to this celebration of my esteemed colleague in 19th century studies, my fellow Chicagoan, and my dear friend, Hollis Clayson. As I've thought about what to say today, it's been daunting to imagine being up here with this distinguished group of speakers. Of course, there's more than enough to say about Holly's scholarship and importance for art history generally, more than enough to go around among the four of us. I haven't been worried about that. But I have felt the need for a novel approach, for a distinctive way to account for Holly's many achievements. So I've decided to concentrate on just one of the many qualities I've admired in Holly as a scholar, a teacher, and a person. And though what I'm about to say may sound simple, it's not. It's a talent not nearly so widely shared or so brilliantly exercised as those of us in the academy would flatter ourselves into believing. Here it is. Holly asks great questions. Spend time in a museum with Holly and she's likely to ask more questions of the works in the space of an hour than anyone I know. She's curious about all sorts of things, big and small. It's not just quantity, of course, that's made her a great interlocutor and a path-breaking art historian. It's the nature of those questions. To start, let me share with you, or no doubt remind many of you, of just a few of the questions Holly's put to paintings in our local collections in the past and more recently. And I'll add that this is a personal homage to the countless hours that almost over 4 decades Holly and I have spent together at the Art Institute and in its exhibitions. Let's see how I go forwards. Why are there so many women on Le Grand Jatte on a Sunday afternoon? That's what Hollis Clayson wanted to know in the mid-1980s. Observing that 14 of the 18 largest figures in this celebrated painting are women, she asked, so where are the men? How obvious that gender imbalance is to us now. How unremarked it was then. It was hearing this question from Holly way back when I was first getting to know her that alerted me to her knack for seeing what was right in front of us, but had been methodologically or ideologically or for some other reason blocked from view. Her question became the basis for her groundbreaking article about notions of masculinity, class distinctions, the family, and leisure time in 1880s Paris, first published in the Art Institute's Museum Studies, 1989. It was a bold intervention in the scholarship then rapidly amassing around this picture, fixated generally on class. It was also an important step towards the distinct feminist approach to 19th century modernism Holly developed in her first book, Painted Love, from 1991. With its provocative readings of Manet, Degas, Cézanne, and Gervex, this book put Hollis Clayson at the forefront of rewriting what had only a few years before been a familiar, comfortable, stale history of modernism. Fundamentally, Painted Love is about ambivalence and indeterminacy in representation, and how that might have resulted for artists, knowingly or not, from their participation in complex social and political developments. Ambivalence and indeterminacy. These were and continue to be interpretive challenges that Holly relishes, those that provoke some of her most pointed interrogations of paintings. But there are other factors that provoke her questions too. In the preface to this book, Holly asks what her history of sexual regulation and representation has to tell us about contemporary issues for women, gays, and others today. As I came to realize then, Holly's questions are also often of this sort, important not only historically and methodologically, but for their social consequence now. Here's another example of what I like to call a Holly question. This one, more recent. What is that lamppost doing in the middle of Caillebott's rainy day? And I quote from a text from Holly, and I'll add that what you're about to hear is just a classic example of Holly's unique prose style with its highly compacted, rather unforgettable characterizations. Quote, "While this weighty street light is a kind of actor in the painting's narrative, its daytime uselessness and blindness make it a mere bystander to the picture's stagey image of the bourgeois social everyday in modernity." And she continues, "What remains of interest, albeit a question that cannot easily be answered, is why Caillebott bothered to endow a useless and indeed old-fashioned, if urbanistically integral piece of street furniture with such consequentiality." The questions do not stop there. I'm going to stop quoting here, though, of course, Holly goes on to multiply the questions in the next paragraph. The passage is from Holly's 2019 book, Illuminated Paris. Here, as in her early scholarship, Holly brings extensive empirical research to bear on images. The historical payoff comes when she's able to pinpoint the oddities of a representation and interrogate them. While she often takes the idiosyncratic, like Caillebott's lamppost, as a point of departure, I've come to know that, of course, there are big questions waiting in the wings. How, in the age of Impressionist sunshine, did the aesthetics of light come to have a dialectical underside? The lure and danger of newfangled nighttime lighting. What anxieties, opportunities, and pictorial challenges did modernization in the basic medium of representation, light itself, create for image makers, commentators, and exhibition organizers? Holly's essays exploring these issues put this book at the forefront of recent interdisciplinary work on art, technology, and urban social life. So thus far, you've had the pleasure of hearing Holly questions from the beginning of her career and from more recent times. To suggest the broad arc of her research and methodological innovation, let's go back to a career midpoint, already discussed beautifully by my colleague, Tom Crow. In the preface to her 2002 book, Paris in Despair, Art in Everyday Life Under Siege, Holly puts a gutsy question to her readers. And as she so often does, she puts it to herself as well. Quote, "Why have I written a book about art produced in Paris during the Franco-Prussian War, an obscure conflict without celebrity in the annals of modern art?" End quote. Covering the 133 days when the Prussians held Paris under siege, Holly turns that obscure conflict without celebrity into an important moment for 19th century art history and its methodologies. She explores artistic production under the most extreme of physical, social, and political pressures. The collapse during the siege of the distinction between public and private, the morphing of gender identifications across allegorical images, the loss of professional structures, the multiplying of identities as artists became soldiers, became starving citizens, became desperate individuals. There is more than enough complexity to keep the questions coming from Holly across the 482 pages of this behemoth of a book. With this project, I came to realize how, for Holly, methodological nicety will never win out over the messiness of history. She made the case here that social art history needed to attend not only to its traditional grounding in class, but to the actions of individuals as individuals. With this micro-historical approach, she amassed materials to stage big questions about how we narrate the history of 19th century art. Was the siege a time of historical rupture in representational practice, or continuity, or just suspension? It strikes me that in taking on this challenging problem, Holly gravitated once again towards the sort of situation that always seems to intrigue her: images and periods of ambiguity and in-betweenness. As in some of my favorite essays by her, on the representation of thresholds in paintings, figures by windows and doors that are neither inside nor outside, public nor private, it's indeterminacy that provokes Holly's curiosity and produces her most probing interpretations. In researching the messiness of history, Holly goes wherever her questions take her, and that can be far and wide. For Illuminated Paris, she sought out French lighting technicians and dealers to help identify fixtures like the one in this Cassat print, resulting in a tour de force essay in that book. Holly became a printmaker herself so as to understand from the inside various techniques. That too paid off spectacularly in the Cassat essay. For her first book, I think I'm right about this, Holly asked Paris prostitutes about their experiences. Jane Roos described the contents of Holly's Siege of Paris book thus, quote, "In-depth studies of such topics as gaslight, the National Guard, military uniforms, Paris fortifications, balloon flights, carrier pigeons, food rationing, and life in the caves during the bombardment," end quote. Each of those topics and more besides got its share of painstaking primary research. This is curiosity of a special sort. Holly wants to ask questions from the inside of lived experience. She's a scholar, to be sure, but not a distanced one. She doesn't rest content to read in the library, sit in the archive, or stand in the museum. Recently, Holly has been climbing up the insides of the Statue of Liberty. Yes, that's Holly up there. We'll have to wait for her forthcoming book on the Eiffel Tower to know what questions she's been putting to Gustave Eiffel's engineering. I'm impressed with this latest project. Holly is now immersed in the challenge of writing a book for a popular audience. It will expand even further her already considerable impact in the public arena. When we think of an event like this, the one this afternoon, a Festschrift-like affair, we of course focus on scholarship. But to do justice to Holly's accomplishments, we need to expand the scope and think about a broader arena. To that end, I asked the Alice Kaplan Humanities Institute at Northwestern, where Holly was director for 6 years, for photos of her in action. They immediately sent back the one I'm about to show you. This, they said, is their all-time favorite image of Holly Clayson, whom everyone there regards as, quote, Humanities Institute royalty. It shows Holly around the time when the French government made her a chevalier for her distinguished academic achievements. Here in this photo at the Humanities Institute, however, she is being celebrated as a different sort of chevalier, one named Maurice. A magical combination of talents has made Holly a superb public lecturer. A quick intellect, a sparkling wit, a sometimes stupefying vocabulary, and a real stage presence. Those same talents have made her much in demand as an impresario to help shape scholarship at the highest level of our profession. To her leadership at the Humanities Institute at Northwestern, add visiting multiple professorships and fellowships at these places. You've already heard these, but I'll repeat them. The Clark Art Institute, the Getty, CASFA, INHA in Paris, NYU, the Huntington Library, and this list could go on. Now, I have to say that my own favorite image of Holly in the context of the public arena and professional service is rather different. Here she is, locked out of her office at CASFA because of the 2013 government shutdown. She's pissed. Perhaps she was going to go through those doors that day to finish a brilliant article. Or perhaps her day was going to be devoted to activities that can easily fall below the radar as we think about what builds a legacy in art history. These are the day in, day out differences Holly has made with her civic mindedness. She's devoted countless hours to being an organizer, contributor, or respondent for conferences, to writing book and exhibition reviews, to serving on CAA and other professional committees, to reviewing manuscripts for presses, to evaluating fellowship applications. In the spirit of this afternoon, which I understand is to encourage intergenerational reflection, let's be grateful for the innumerable times Holly has helped younger scholars just starting out, talking about their work over coffee, introducing them to other scholars, or as I know well, just following up, as she always does, with an email the next day about some art historical point or another that came up in casual conversation. A lot of people in this room, I imagine, can immediately think now of moments when their lives and careers have taken a good turn, maybe a consequential one, thanks to a conversation, a call, an email from Holly Clayson. And then there's the teaching, the incredible teaching. Holly once told me that the question with which I began this talk, where are the men on Le Grand Jatte, was something that just occurred to her as she was lecturing in a class. She found herself just blurting it out. That tells us something about Holly's teaching. She's not been afraid to skate on thin ice in front of students. She wants them out there with her, traversing new territory, asking questions to which she doesn't have the answers, and more daring still, questions that are just at that moment in the making. No wonder she won the first ever CAA award for a junior professor and has gone on to win numerous others for exceptional teaching. If anything, Holly's been even more impactful as a graduate teacher. I know whereof I speak. Way back in 1994, Holly and I co-taught a graduate course together entitled The Spaces of Parisian Art, 1848 to 1914. It brought 13 University of Chicago graduate students together with approximately the same number of Northwestern students, each population having, let's just say, decidedly different notions of what made for good art history. This seminar was a challenge. When I looked recently over a list of the students in that course, I recalled vividly how much I learned then from Holly pedagogically. Despite the chasms between our different student groups, I remember how adept Holly was at reaching across the divide to pique a student's curiosity, regardless of their methodological allegiance, by invoking what she knew of them individually. Holly brought forth their best because she was genuinely interested in them, not only as a scholar in the making, but as a person too. Most of those students, and I have the figure 30 PhDs listed on her CV, for whom she's been a principal advisor, and the 36 others whose committee she served on since 1990, have gone on to write important dissertations and secure fine positions. I like to imagine, too, that they've absorbed the art of person-centered pedagogy and the talent for asking great questions. And they're using both of these gifts from Holly to shape the future of art history. Now, I can't let this topic of Holly's teaching go without mentioning one more thing. Holly is not exactly staid in the classroom. Sometimes she's quirky, often she's fun, and always she's fashionable. Let me close with a scenario that all of those of you who know Holly will recognize. And I apologize for this highly pixelated image. I use it only because it's the exact expression on Holly's face I wanted in a photograph. This is a scene that could take place in a classroom, in a museum, in a conference, or a one-on-one conversation. This is Holly Clayson getting ready to ask a question. She is listening intently. She may soon shake her head slightly. She may clear her voice a bit. She is beginning to wind up. She offers a few preliminary starts and restarts as she searches for just the right phrase. Do I know that? She begins. Do we know that? How could it possibly be that? Holly is simultaneously searching, finding, and reacting to what she is about to say. And then out it comes, a penetrating, articulate, electrifying question. Suddenly, the room comes alive. Rather than leave you with a highly pixelated image of Holly, let me close with this one. I like to imagine it's Holly fielding a question from her audience. She's great not only at asking questions, you should know, but answering them as well. Thank you.
Our next speaker, Marc Gotlieb, is class of 1955 Memorial Professor of Art and Halverson Director of the Williams Graduate Program in the History of Art. A past editor-in-chief of the Art Bulletin, he's taught at Emory University and at the University of Toronto. His work has opened up the field of 19th century European art to rigorous inquiry with topics ranging from academic painting to Orientalism and Romanticism. In 2021 to 2022, he was the Lila Wallace Reader's Digest Visiting Professor at ITAT with the topic, How Artists Die, the Poetics of Mortality in 19th Century Art. He is currently preparing a study on the role of the viewer in the art of Jean-Léon Gérôme, as well as the study of the teacher-student conflicts in 19th century art, pedagogy, and artistic experience. Like Marty, he has a special place in Holly's acknowledgements in Paris and Despair for encouraging the project, offering invaluable advice, and methodological judiciousness. Let's welcome Marc Gotlieb.
Thanks very much, Hector, and it's a very pleasure to be here and honored to be here. I think Marty said that, Holly said they should strike a medal for Marty, or Marty said they should strike a medal for Holly. I can't remember who. That could have gone either way, and they should strike a medal. Holly's actually, I think, a collector of medals, and David Danger didn't strike a medal for Holly, and I don't think we strike medals anymore in honor of distinguished professors, but we should. So I just wanted to start with this one of George Sand, and it should say underneath, which we would say of Holly, although I don't know any Latin, but it should say Augusta Felix Litteris, wise in letters. And I want to say 6 very brief things about Holly that are wise in letters. I just said one of them, so I have 5 left. So when I was asked to be here and speak about Holly today, it was a great pleasure for me to take the opportunity to reread Painted Love and Paris and Despair and other work. And I stopped at some of the paintings that she talked about that made a big difference on me in my own work and thinking. And one of them was a painting by James Joseph Tissot that she talks about in Painted Love, and quite a memorable analysis of the young lady in the shop, painting in the art gallery of Ontario. And I'm not going to rehearse Holly's argument, but if you've read the text, you'll remember, and if not, much of it is centered on 3 separate sets of exchanges structured around gender in late 19th century Paris. The woman opening the door for a client that we presume to be male, though not necessarily. The male figure on the other side of the window looking in at the shopkeeper, and then in the background, an encounter between a woman and a man who seems to be saluting her ever so slightly. And this is it's a modest example in light of the numerous extended discussions in Painted Love, but it struck me because of the sharpness and acuity with which Holly seized right away on the structure of looking and being looked at in later 19th century Paris. And it's a theme that she continued in that book, but also beyond. And when I said I took the opportunity to reread a lot of Holly's work, one of the artists that she's come back to is Tissot, actually. And in 2023, that is to say just a number of months ago, she published in the Getty Journal a wonderful essay on verisimilitude and obstruction in Tissot's Thames pictures. And to me, rereading Holly's work, what I noticed to me is Holly is her work has changed and evolved. And that's the sort of the second thing I want to talk about. It was really interesting to me to think that the kinds of interpretations generated in Painted Love, as compelling and interesting as they are also not quite the same as the kind of interpretations that she was developing here in 2023. And I don't know if Tissot has changed a lot. This painting's actually earlier than the Shop Girl, but it's really interesting and powerful for me to watch Holly change. If you have a chance to look at this essay, it's really a meditation on a kind of disconnect. There is an effort to dislodge Tissot from these pictures in particular, from a prevailing interpretation centered around issues of his identity, his relationship to the marketplace, the place of these pictures in an emerging sort of metropolitan and imperial culture, all really important questions. But Holly, again and again, as she reads through, looks at this and other pictures, starts struggling, I don't know, struggles to, wrestling with the painting's indeterminacy, and in particular the rigging in the background. To me, there's sort of three aspects to this reading that are very powerful for me. One is just the account of the art historical account of Tissot at this moment, the methodological challenge that she poses in her readings of these works of art, of not to over-instrumentalize the work, not to be too hasty in nailing its meaning according to a certain a priori sense of where this lands in the metropolitan and metropole culture of the moment, and not to try and be too fixed even with the subject position of Tissot himself. Sometimes these pictures are, Tissot was possibly a communard. These are done in London after he flees Paris, and Holly and others sort of wrestle with what relationship Tissot, these paintings might have had to that major event. But in the end, and as the essay sort of builds up, there is a plea for the complexity of these works and the indeterminacy that is contained even in the rigging itself. Your account, because Holly's right there, so I'm sorry to speak to her in the third person, but there is the rigging, her account of the rigging is really an allegory of her own evolving sense of art historical enterprise, because the essay ends in a kind of melancholy note as a plea for our inability ultimately to know. And I don't mean this in a kind of hyper nostalgic idealized sense, but in the Tissot Shop Girl, we think we know who's looking at who, but by the time now Holly turns to this painting, who is looking at who and for what reason is much less clear, and she's really attentive to the impossibility and the indeterminacy of establishing those relationships. The rigging in particular, the confused character of it, the density of it, the way that it's cropped, to me it is an allegory, a poetics of her own enterprise as she continues to deepen the interpretation of specific works and not rush towards meaning. Now, ambivalence and indeterminacy are there in Painted Love, as Martha mentioned, but I was very struck in this essay just recently written as how much Holly put this in the foreground. And to me, it's not just a question of art historical method, but really a poetics of her own enterprise and her own efforts to struggle to put together art historical meaning and the difficulty that we all face with that. So, third part. Let me see if we have another slide there. So Holly, okay, so I won't leave this on the screen too long, but I taught a class last year called The Scene of Decapitation in European Art, 1400 to 1900, and it was the most popular class I've ever taught in my whole life. I had all the cool students in class. It was a very interesting experience, so for sure I'm going to teach it again. But Holly and I really bonded over this painting, about which she has written very eloquently by Henri Regnault, whom, as Tom mentioned, was killed in the Franco-Prussian War in January 1871. And I wanted to talk a little bit about Paris in Despair. It was the work for me that was profoundly transformative as I was writing my own study of Regnault, and my closest engagement with what we call, if we still call, the social history of art. I actually want to call it, since we're speaking about Holly, something like, and even though we're looking at a decapitation, the sociability of the history of art. And Holly, for me and for many others, has been a model of a kind of intellectual sociability that is mediated personally and intellectually across this collective art historical enterprise. That sociability and that social history of art, the relationship between social and sociability, I'm trying to suggest, is quite is an interesting one. That sociability is enacted and it's performed. A book that was important for me, though important for many of you, is that little text by Chris and Otto Kurtz, Legend, Myth, and Magic in the Image of the Artist in 1937, and they have this phrase that they talk about of enacted biography, and the ways in which artists internalize and reproduce topoi and tropes, and in ancient times, but also in the present day, and we do that too as art historians. So in terms of the sociability of art, and Holly Clayson in particular, there's, when Holly was a fellow at the Clark Art Institute, this was before I was affiliated with the institution, a certain incident happened that really kind of embodied this intersection between the social history of art and her exceptional sociability. Now, the thing with enacted biography is the stories aren't always true, but they are performed and repeated as if true, and sometimes embraced by those that it's about in the first place. So I think it was a late evening, and a call came in to the security office at the Clark, and Holly, who was living in the living quarters there, was a little concerned because there appeared to be a video camera she remembers, okay, there was a video camera that was posted right outside her door that was in effect monitoring all the movements inside the house, including who went in and who went out. Now, Holly, being an extraordinary exemplar of the social history of art, immediately understood this and seized on it. And very next day, the executive committee of the Clark Art Institute gathered and went to see and look at it. And of course, it was like a motion detector for the lights or something or other. It was not but this story has been circulated and recirculated quite often in the annals of Northern Berkshire County. And I think it, I'm trying to figure out where the story goes, but it's not paranoid. It's a very loving and funny anecdote in the end, and ways in which our own intellectual and political and art historical commitments can sometimes be intertwined with the details of our everyday. This, for me, is the enacted life, the enacted biography of an art historian that Holly exemplifies, and I've had many, many opportunities to consider them. But Paris in Despair is an exceptional text. I'm not sure I don't want to rehearse what Marty and Tom already said about it, but for me, it offered such the way in which Holly seized on the siege of Paris as a moment of a kind of suspension, when so many of temporal suspension, of suspension of a lot of the hierarchies, of a lot of the divisions that might have obtained in the art world and in other dimensions, kind of bracketed from the progress of 19th century modernism, and looked at this 3-4 month period with such sensitivity to different agents, different actors, not just Henri Regnault, but countless others, ephemeral works of art, snowmen in the shape of sculptures made out of snow, and it was the creativity with which she isolated this moment, which, as Tom mentioned, had really rarely been identified as an art historical moment of any meaningfulness, was a model of intellectual procedure for me and for many of us as well. So, fourth part, what would Holly say? So in Painted Love, I want to go back to Painted Love, there is a paint, she reproduces a painting by an artist named Daniel Bouveret, done around in the early 1880s. And I think we can kind of, if you haven't read Painted Love, or it's been a while, I think we can still, I think I've got 2 slides layered on top of each other, by the way, so you can ignore that effect. I think we sort of understand what Holly wants to talk about. She refers to the 2 gentlemen, the swells that she calls them, walking down the street, the accidentally running into passing a milliner, a laundress, who is sitting on a bench with a kind of interiorized sense of melancholy that we associate with the depiction of women in France in the 1870s and 80s. And they're glancing at her in a somewhat aggressive, leering manner, and the rest of the interpretation flows from there. And it's a characteristic, very brilliant microanalysis that is in the page, in the middle of Painted Love. So what would Holly say? Because a drawing recently surfaced of a preparatory drawing for this painting. And I thought maybe we could do as a group, though I actually not saying we should do that, but ask knowing what we do of this drawing, what would Holly Clayson now say about the painting? Because there are some really, really interesting changes. And one of the amazing things about Holly's work is, as both Tom and Marty talked about, is her attention to the density of works of art, to the meaningfulness of the artistic decisions they contained, even though she doesn't make particularly claims around the artist's intention. The intentions are inchoate, sometimes invisible, but they're intentional works of art nevertheless. So let's take a look at them together. And I don't know, I think Holly, if she had the opportunity to speak, and I'm really not giving her that opportunity, but I think she really might want to say, wow, look at those book racks. And what are the bouquinistes? I don't know what they call the actual cabinets. Look how Daniel Bouveret opened them. Right? And to me, the fact that they're open, and they're sort of looking, and now the painting seems to be that much more threatening in a way, and entirely consistent with the sort of aggressive structure of the gaze that is being put in place here. And of course, the figures have changed too. The man with the top hat has now got a different kind of hat, but I keep on going back to those bookcases. And I know Holly, who asks really good questions, is now going to be thinking about this for quite a long time. Actually, she's right there. So I'm actually watching her think, and I'm watching that look that Marty just mentioned. And I don't think she knew this drawing, but I really think she's going to have something special to say about this painting, which has a very small place in Painted Love, but I think now a bigger place in her intellectual history. So fifth part, an artist that Holly hasn't spent that much time on is Jean-Léon Gérôme, but it's an artist that I've been spending quite a long time on. And I have had a couple of opportunities to talk about Gérôme with Holly, and they've always been rewarding and very fruitful. This is his Oedipus, painted in 1862 and then redone around 1880. You may not be familiar to, you maybe remember seeing it here. Okay, there's Joachim Phoenix sitting on a horse, and those of you who have seen Napoleon will recognize this. All right, so and certainly my own interest in Gérôme partly has to do with how his work has been mediated into mass culture, which is another arena where Holly has been particularly her work is particularly rich and fruitful. Holly has something to say about Gérôme, but she hasn't said it yet. It's there, and I'm wondering what she's thinking. That's a picture of Holly Clayson. So that's, it's in art history we call like a Rückenfigure. It's the one technical term that we're still allowed to use when we're teaching undergraduates. And there's Napoleon seen from behind looking at the Sphinx, and Holly seen from behind looking at Gérôme and Napoleon. Now, I don't want to say that Holly, and this is really the last point I want to make about being wise in letters. I don't want to say that Holly's work is Napoleonic or any kind of identification in that regard, but I do want to ask David Danger's permission to think about Holly not in profile but in three quarters, facing us, as she has, as her work has faced us so many times. They should strike a medal. I'm actually, I just heard moments ago, when I was sitting there a little earlier before we started, that the executive committee of the College Art Association has authorized the striking of a medal for Holly Clayson, thanks to a generous grant from the Williams Graduate Program in the History of Art. It's going to look like this. Okay. Still in preliminary stages of design. Wise in letters. So, Holly, thank you very much for your amazing partnership with me intellectually, and your work is continuing to grow, evolve, and let its indeterminacy reign. So, thank you.
So our last speaker on the program is André Dombrowski. He's the Francis Shapiro Weitzenhofer Associate Professor of 19th Century European Art at the University of Pennsylvania. As you heard, in 2016, he and Holly co-edited Is Paris Still the Capital of the 19th Century? Essays on Art and Modernity, 1815 to 1900. Just one manifestation of their intellectual collaboration. Like Holly, he's engaged with the emergence of the avant-garde in Paris, as in his studies of Cézanne, and how the production of art is firmly intertwined with and implicated in social, political, scientific, and technological developments. In 2020 to 21, he was the Paul Mellon Senior Fellow at the Center for Visual Arts with the project Monet's Minutes, Impressionism in the Industrialization of Time, which appeared as a monograph in 2023. Please join me in welcoming André.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Anne. Thank you, Hector, for moderating. Thank you to CAA for organizing this and making this all happen. And mostly my warmest congratulations to you, Holly, for this richly deserved award. What you're all missing out there, I will say, is watching Holly's reactions to the proceedings, which are priceless. And you will also think in a minute that the four of us coordinated, but we actually didn't, I swear. I don't know about you, but it sometimes happens to me that I walk through a museum and stumble upon an artwork thinking, this would evidently benefit from the Clayson interpretive touch. It happened to me last a few months ago when I was in Cleveland and stood in front of a newly acquired James Tissot called Two Figures at a Door, The Proposal, ? A title that could come from Holly herself for an artist she has regularly thought about. Two figures stand inside a doorway betwixt and between indoor and outdoor, hovering at a threshold and coming into view only as much as door frames and glass panes permit. At that threshold, a young woman is propositioned by a male figure behind her, yet the nature of that proposal, material, marital, sexual, remains unknown. She has turned towards the viewer to consider and reflect, asserting briefly her own agency in the transaction in which she stood, after all, to remain the property of men. He looms close and over her. Even though he does not appear to threaten, he has nonetheless entered her personal space intently. Hemmed in by the phallus are Holly's words for another context and work of art. The painting was painted in 1872, shortly after Tissot arrived for a long and prosperous career in London from France. Expat, cosmopolitan, figure of alterity are some of Holly's favorite descriptors for artists with multiple passports and the period equivalent of frequent flyer programs. So, when the female figure in the painting is looking inward and backward, her look represents partly the painter's look, staring back at a still war-torn post-Franco-Prussian War nation he had just left behind for good. Tissot has signed on the lower door, constantly swinging back and forth with each opening of the entryway, backward, forward, past, future, here, there. Nothing seems certain temporally and narratively in the image. Wartime feelings of uneven outcomes par excellence, as Holly knows well and has taught us in her study of the Siege of Paris. As they are facing the viewer, the figures have turned away from the garden, away from the sun, shielded by a large awning that blocks the view into the distance and towards the daylight. They face towards their interior instead, confronting a wholly different kind of light, moodier, darker, more even and paler than the flickering of luminous effects that stream in from behind, from the out of doors, registering on the backs of dresses and hairdos. Maybe, just maybe, a new lamp has been purchased and is being tried out in its new place on the opposite side of the room, making the painting one about competitive lighting modalities. At their threshold, artificial and natural light fuse, and we have to thank Holly's interpretive skills for our newfound ability to see and understand that fusion. Finally, and I know I'm reaching here in ways Holly never would, could it be that the Eiffel Tower, with its slender triangular shape, is prefigured here as well, only in the most suggestive ways? Of course, in those elegant, pensive fingers, marvels of joints and elongation, the tower already standing upright twice, and on everyone's lips 2 decades before it was built. The proposal, ? Is then a thoroughly Claysonesque painting. It is a psychic picture puzzle with a thwarted narrative structure and a disenchanted sense of direction, full of suspense, question marks, and hermeneutic ellipses. In short, a painting ready for a trademark Clayson interpretation. Holly likes to think betwixt and between, again, her title, or in her favorite pictorial space of the threshold. Paintings and prints to her can contain nightmarish scenarios. Gender is hardly fixed and desire rarely pure. Wartime puts representation most to the test. Interiors are full of dread and doom, light artificial and cruel, and the Eiffel Tower an ominous presence. Holly knows that pictures and monuments mobilize such uncertainty and dread for ideological reasons, to keep the new and unfamiliar at bay, to direct attention towards or away deeper issues that were actually at stake. What she has taught us above all, I think, is the value of visual inconclusiveness, and she has permitted generations of scholars of 19th century art to take it seriously too, visually, emotionally, ethically. These are the central issues of Holly's work, and I believe she devised them in response to the art history she had been handed when she started out. I'll leave the precise dates of that start a little murky. An art history then in the throngs of the social history of art, with its complex visual analyses of art in and for the public sphere, that most masculine of spatial constructions and privileges. Cue the contradictory nature of the female flaneuse or the gay Parisienne, some of Holly's favorite archetypes. But also an art history then still in the throngs of late post-Panofskian iconographic investigations and the rising voices of a feminist art history demanding to make female creativity part of public discourse. Holly's early syllabi for classes on 19th century and modernist art show what range of texts her early career most centrally had to rely on and reply to. I could pretend now that I was the first user of the Hollis Clayson papers recently deposited at Northwestern Libraries and Archives, but these rather precious documents from a typewritten era have come to me by way of my husband, Jonathan Katz, who was among Holly's very first PhD students and TAs, and who can actually never find anything in his office, but somehow managed to materialize these rather precious documents. T.J. Clark, Ted Reff, John House, Robert Herbert are everywhere, and so are John Rewald, Albert Boehm, Richard Sennett, and Eric Hobsbawm. I trust you get my emphasis here regarding the maleness of these voices. Linda Nochlin and Eunice Lipton are the exception, with a few others. Holly's work, of course, comes out of this moment, yet advanced it in unique ways. Above all, I believe, and Holly will surely jump up right now in her chair in a moment if she disagrees, using her trademark sentence, young man, do you truly mean to suggest, kind of stuff. Above all, Holly wanted to point to a different kind of modernity, I think, and a different kind of modernist representation, one less explainable through the male prerogatives of publicness, commodity culture, and Marxist critique, or the politics of revolution, one less focused on the voices of statecraft and official art critical and theoretical proficiency. Rather than open onto the public forum of public discourse, modern imagery for Holly permits viewers to recognize in representation some of their own worries and fears about the modern condition, and not only represented iconographically, but registered in complex spatialities of depiction and complex picture-viewer relationships, in which psychic tension materializes as form. Images in the moment of their creation are cognizant of the viewing subject not only as a public figure, as a representative of their class or their gender, but also as a private one, in lightness and in darkness. This is, of course, by no means a less public form of expression and connection among painter, and audience, but one that centers the individual differently, making the operations of representation more inward focused. But Holly is far from an art historical psychoanalyst. That's not what I'm saying. Rather, she is an interpreter of something quite difficult to trace and even harder to explain: the historical nature of the collective psyche and communal mood. This is why a book like Illuminated Paris is much more than about the relationship between images and new lighting technologies. It profoundly charged the affects associated with them, which Holly so memorably calls luminophilia and luminophobia. 19th century philias and phobias are really her subjects, as concretized in complex image forms and procedures of image making. This is not to say that Holly is our greatest proponent of the complexities of avant-garde painting, far from it. But she sees this capacity of the image to draw our inwardness outward in all kinds of pictures, from paintings to prints to caricatures. Visual sentiment indeed undoes such pictorial hierarchies. This is why we are so often in the interior in Holly's work, at windows or on the darker side of things, near the Eiffel Tower or under the Parisian night sky, why war and conflict are often looming, and why she likes to imagine our eyes wandering between the dark and ultra-thin layers and interstices of the printing press in action. Holly's is an art history of unprecedented psychic tension in which the modern picture registers the complexity of new forms of non-belonging and alienation, as well as the distance between inward self-conception and outward public image. Threshold, darkness, desire, ellipses, puzzlement, those are Holly's favorite terms. Here she is in a relatively recent 2015-16, I believe, talk at the Orsay during the Art and Prostitution exhibit that year, looking back at the publication of Painted Love. Please see that I have really done nothing so far but quote her all along.
In the face of such explicitly sexualized themes, the thing I argued you could see was that in those paintings that interested me, the privileged rhetorics of representation were, here's the adverb of the day, paradoxically, ellipsis and reserve. Now, the tense scenario in Cézanne's watercolor appears to thematize, even allegorize, the conundrum faced by the ambitious period modernist oriented to the practices of modern life when trying to understand and visualize the contemporary prostitute. Or rather, as I wrote previously, it could be read to register an awareness of the impossibility of finding pleasure in the sexual marketplace. And thus it's shot through, I think, with doubts about the erotics of prostitution. The picture is certainly, let's all agree to this, a scene of puzzlement.
Puzzlement. This was not the mood of the social history of art as Holly found it, circa 1980, in the work of Clark, Herbert, and others, in which art is beholden to a kind of compulsory pleasure, in which a forced nonchalance and ease seem to camouflage the realities of a deep class and gender war. In Holly's work, there's more room in the picture for showing this modern warfare directly. There's less belief in the artistic power of sublimation. Instead, Holly excavates and celebrates an artist's ability to express modern discomfort directly and unequivocally as modern form. This interpretive strategy on Holly's part has had an immense following and influence. I think the whole interior discourse in our field would be unthinkable without her, and so would be the study of 19th century printmaking or our thinking around light in the period, among many other topics. She authorized me, for one, to think about a darker kind of modernism in depictions of violence and murder in the early work of Paul Cézanne, when I did not have any models from the social history of art to do so, or to see the machinery, the techniques of standard time in operation in Impressionism in the ways that she saw war or light technology pressing into pictures, yet failing to catalyze representation. I believe this approach has been so influential because it limned the outline of something called personality, subjectivity, and agency in representation, not as an aspect of artistic genius of those oh so great and overrated male painters, or as identity politics, but as a complex evocation of the collective psychic dramas of modern representation. Despite its object and historical focus, hers then is a profoundly subject and subjectivity-oriented approach, and thereby deeply self-assessing, even self-affirming on both ends of the then and now. Through it, she made a home for a number of younger, searching, and itinerant scholars that was not centrally structured around capitalism and class, but focused on inquiries related to sexuality, gender, selfhood, ethnicity, geography, and numerous other forms of difference. She was among the first to see the need for this, I think, a need that has only grown since she started. Holly was not my dissertation advisor, although in many ways she could have been, I think, and certainly mentored me with real dedication in my early professional career and to this day, for which I'll always be grateful, Holly. Jonathan and I are probably, but I'm not entirely sure, so you'll correct me, the only art historical couple that she has trained and mentored in the expanded sense of that term. From our first meeting sometime in the early 2000s, Holly has been one of the most generous interlocutors I have worked with, coming to so many of my talks and reading oh so many drafts of essays and chapters, never saying no to any request for help. I'm sure her actual students can testify to this total dedication as well. Her questions and relentless probing, always helpful and deeply thoughtful, meant the world to me as I found my footing in the field. As we began working together on a conference at the Clark in the late 2000s and an edited volume and other projects, I did give Holly a nickname, Field Marshal Clayson. The paradox of a feminist field marshal very much invoked. Here she is taking over the Northwestern newsroom with reports from the front of art history, a spot she seems quite to relish. Her attention to detail is unsurpassed, and so is her ability to boss others around a bit in perfectly gentle and friendly ways. My own parents being a bit more laissez-faire post-war Germans, I wasn't used to someone who would actually check in regularly with me to see if I was actually working and doing what I said I would. At the time, in my first years of full-time teaching, it turned out that that was exactly what I needed, even though I did not quite know that at the time, but Holly did know that instinctively. Over the years, I came to trust her, not only on the level of content then, but also on the level of professional comportment. If Holly did this generous act for someone to whom she owed nothing, like me, I can only imagine with how much thoroughness and dedication she advised the students under her charge. And I see her there as another pioneer of a close and dedicated form of advising, something that I'm sure you will all agree has become more the norm since I was a grad student myself. Holly cultivates admirably an affective relationship with her advisees and models both a deeply affectionate scholarship and mentorship. There are then many psychic depths onto which art and its study opens, but Holly provided the field with an exquisite and carefully drawn roadmap to navigate them on all levels, and continues to do so every day. Thank you.
And now I'd like to invite Holly up to the podium for some words.
Perhaps you can imagine that being the recipient of these extraordinary, probing, kind disquisitions on me, I'm a little bit, yes, I am uncharacteristically speechless. But before I heard these wonderful things that I'm still trying to digest, I decided that I would make a small list of what I thought this, I don't know if it's interesting or not, but it would give me something to say I thought I would make a small list of what I reckon to be, at least in my own case, the stepping stones to success and even a little bit of happiness in university-based art history. Here they come. Number one, I recommend that you obtain this if you can. I was the lucky, fortunate, and in many ways accidental recipient of excellent training. And I was thinking of what the interesting things that my friend Tom had to say about whether the centrality of Paris, and thinking that I happened to wander into that training just at the moment when historiographically the study of Paris was where the action was. And so I climbed aboard. Some of you know that. I relinquished my developing expertise in a combination of sub-Saharan African art and the Pasadena, California Tournament of Roses parade in order to work on 19th century Paris instead. Does that make sense, that sequence? Not really, but that's what happened. Okay, so excellent training. And I've always possessed, I think this is fair to say, a kind of Midwestern Girl Scout work ethic. I mean, I am a Midwestern Girl Scout, you know, and I think that some of you have nicely mentioned that I do have a kind of overwrought sense of having to be a good Girl Scout and get work done all the time and not slough off too much. The other thing, and this emerged a bit in maybe what André said, is that people who know me well, especially at this moment in my life, know extremely well that the thing that gives me the greatest pleasure is telling other people what to do. So that also ends up being an extremely worthwhile characteristic if you are indeed engaged in teaching and advising and also having to write stuff. Also, you know, the journey that I have followed has also been punctuated and enabled by a tremendous amount of good luck. I don't know, being in the right place at the right time. I also think in terms of, you know, despite the complexity of what my friends have said about my work and what it accomplished and where it came from and what it contained, and actually my friend Marty Ward helped me understand this when I had to write something recently. I think that one of the things that I think I have, or that I don't have, is that I don't have any particular prejudice about what's interesting or not interesting to look at and write about. I sort of have gone toward objects of analysis and study, sort of whatever sort of struck my curiosity at the moment, and whatever, here it comes, made me ask questions that I hadn't asked before. So a kind of non-prejudiced, sort of slightly, as we say in the Midwest, higgledy-piggledy pursuit of things that seemed unexplained. And it made me curious. And the other thing, and I recommend that you develop one if you don't have one yet, is a sense of humor that makes all aspects of this world that we're in, I think, go more smoothly. My husband thinks that my sense of humor has made a lot of people think I'm frivolous. I know that's true, but there's not much I can do about it at this time. So you know, that's not a very elegant prepared speech, but it's the sort of best I can do in terms of self-analysis at this moment. And mostly I want to, I don't know, thank my friends. I received analyses and commentaries that were much more nuanced and kind than I certainly deserve, and I'm very grateful for them, and thanks to Anne and Hector for running the show. Do you think, Hector and Anne, should I show myself to be willing to answer questions if people had any? Would that be an appropriate gesture? Or questions could be asked about what these four people said, you know? You could certainly pose questions to them. Or is it time to leave and start drinking? I haven't looked at my watch. Hector, what are you doing? Oh, I see, okay. Hector's pouring cocktails for everyone.
We will try to look into the light.
You can't imagine how blinding it is up here.
We see a hand, yes?
Who's that?
This is such a beautiful occasion, moment to witness. So thank all of you, and especially Holly, for creating the life and the work that this is in honor of. This is celebrating. But my question is, I'm Richard. I don't know if you can see me.
Is it Richard?
Yeah, it's Richard.
You can, it's so blinding up here.
No.
Yes.
But actually, so allusions were made in various ways by André, by you, I'm trying to remember now, by Tom, because each speaker was so, the remarks were obviously so nuanced and genuine, it's hard to keep them all in mind. But I would like to hear a little bit more about your training and what you meant when you said, Paris was on the itinerary in a way that it hadn't been before, and also I got the suggestion, or I thought that it sounded from what André was saying, that there was a kind of conflict or at least tension between the social history of art and feminists, the beginnings of a Anglophone feminist art history. And I just don't remember, or I don't imagine things quite that way. So I'm wondering if you can illuminate that for me.
I mean, Richard, you're asking a very big question, but let me see what I can do. And I don't want to get all autobiographical. And also, if I get all autobiographical, I mean, you're going to figure out how old I am. Anyway, I'm not too old to run for president. Anyway, so, I mean, I've sort of, this it's a journey, that's a horrible metaphor. I ended up being in the art history business because I was an undergraduate art history major, and I had an extremely conventional training as an undergraduate art history major, where I went to college, something alien and without any value whatsoever, namely American art, was not taught because it had no value whatsoever. It was a place that taught only European art in a very sort of narrow frame. Okay, so that's sort of where I started. And then completely by accident, I ended up going to graduate school where I went to graduate school. I guess I should admit this to you. I did have an ID card to go to the IFA at NYU, but just before I was gonna go, I went to the movies with an old friend from high school. We went to see a movie that had just opened called Midnight Cowboy. Have we heard of Midnight Cowboy? And because, as I've already said, I was a card-carrying Midwestern Girl Scout, I realized then that if I went to school in New York City, I would end up like Ratso Rizzo. So I cut the ID card into pieces and threw it in the wastebasket. Anyway, nothing but rational life choices from me. Anyway, and then I ended up, it's a long story. I ended up by accident at UCLA, and it was that moment, Richard, that I'm sure you know a great deal about. When anyway, I thought I was going to study the art of sub-Saharan Africa, and that ended up moving over into an ethnographic study of the then contemporary Tournament of Roses parade in Pasadena. And then a rather eventually very influential person who started writing about the socio-political history of 19th century French art ended up being a professor there, and I jumped on that bandwagon. But as I've said in other things I've written and talked about, my in some ways, what I ended up focusing on, it's not about France. It's not because I admired the revolution or something. It's because that very moment in that nexus of issues, that's where the historiographic action was. That's where the big questions were being asked. That's where the excitement was. So who wouldn't climb onto that? And to say I climbed on a bandwagon makes it sound trivial. I was making I thought a principled choice. So that's where the big questions were being asked. So that's where I wanted to be. And it was also at that moment almost simultaneous. I'm not going to name names, but you know who they are, were some very, very powerful Anglophone feminists stepped up and also began looking at 19th century French art in new ways. And that dynamic combination, who wouldn't want to be part of that enterprise? And that's you know, I happen to, I don't know, I happen to be in that world at that dynamic moment. So, you know, I said goodbye to the Rose Parade and hello to prostitution. I mean, who wouldn't, right? Does that sort of, yeah.
Yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
I just wonder whether writing about gender and sexuality was met with resistance, because I felt like it was met with resistance later when I tried to do it, when I did do it in a different context in terms of AIDS and queer culture. But I'm wondering, in your moment, I can't imagine it was welcomed in all quarters.
No, I mean, sort of, maybe it is time to name, well, anyway, it was, I don't think it's right to say it was met with resistance. I think it was, I think in many spheres, it was met with great interest and fascination, and eventually, you know, a shot of admiration, and eventual then a kind of wholesale attempt to emulate, not just me, but I mean, there were a whole lot of people, my generation, who began asking those kinds of questions. Yeah.
Would you mind if I just said a little?
No, of course not. Is that alive?
Yeah.
I mean.
Yeah, this will be memory lane time, but I
mean,
think
Tom-
it's
Tom-
entirely.
You know, Tom and I were, yes, we made a similar
Deserved.
choice
I
at
mean-
exactly the same moment.
Holly's remarks about African art, about the Rose Parade, that's owed to the late Arnold Rubin,
And it's an important thing to acknowledge seriously.
whom I think we owed a huge debt to, and were able to come to this developing European French social history of art with other thoughts and other kinds of feelings and ways of looking at things that Arnold helped provide.
And you were able to talk about that in your new book to some degree.
Thank you for the
Yeah.
plug. The Artist in the Counterculture. And we had, as a pretty inspiring and forceful visiting professor, Carol Duncan. And that was, you know, the feminist history of the avant-garde and of the 18th century before practically there was one.
You're right.
And Carol hasn't capitalized on that or become the big, you know, name to conjure with that she really deserves. But we had the benefit of her presence, and she threw herself into it, and the whole thing was great fun. And we had all that going, plus, you know, a certain rigor introduced by one Karl Wehrmeister, which didn't hurt either. And, you know, that was
Speak for yourself. Anyway, yeah, go ahead.
Yes, well, I didn't have to live with him later on. But at the time, as an abrasive kind of force, it was something that added to all of this. And Richard wanted to know about training. I just felt I should just jump in and say.
Yes, please. Yeah.
The training that I think we both had, I certainly feel very much indebted to.
Yeah, and it was just this sort of convergence, right, of players and topics and interests and questions that you and I mean, there was no class catalog that we read in advance and decided to go there. It all just sort of emerged and happened and developed sort of sur place while we were there. You and I did not we didn't go to graduate school to study that stuff that we ended up studying. No. Any other, I don't know, issues, topics, questions that might be worth, or, but should I look at my watch? Oh, look at that, it's 6:30. Well, how about thanking all of you for, oh, Marty, yeah,
So I have a very trivial question
I doubt it.
no, it is.
Oh, okay.
It is. That our mutual friend, Tom Cummins, told me I should ask you. So this is a question that Tom Cummins, a mutual friend of ours, told me just before this session that I should ask Holly. It's not too embarrassing, but I will ask it. Tom wanted you to say where your very first publication appeared.
Hughes Air West Sundancer magazine. Does he have any more questions?
I think that
Is that on my CV? No, it's not. Yeah.
Thank you very much to everyone who came, and thank you to Holly and to our presenters.
Please join us in thanking Holly for changing the field,
Oh my
for
dear, that's too
changing
soft. That's
our
too
lives. Thank you.
Thank you guys very much.